Hey guys, Brent Hull, Wednesday design video, talking today about a traditional house that I'm going to be teaching about with MBU coming up in the fall. But this is a traditional house, Colonial Revival house that needs some help. And there's probably 5 or 6 things on here that I want to fix and play with that I think are going to help you be able to see this house a little bit better. The way I did this is it's kind of hard to see, but this is kind of showing some of the details and what's happened here. First thing I noticed is that this, the windows are the same size. And so being the same size, you don't get that graduated fenestration. Typically in traditional houses, you have windows that are bigger on the bottom and smaller on the top. And it gives this balance or this weight that really helps it look better. 2, this entablature. 1, it's kind of spread out, kind of wide. Those columns are too small. They're weak, that entablature is weak. There's this really high iron railing that goes around. There's nothing decorative on there. It's weird that they look like they tried to do a plating window there, but they didn't know how to do it, or they kind of chickened out, or something happened because this is kind of a mess. My dormers are really big on this house. And so I'm just gonna fix 4 or 5 things on this thing and I think really help it. 1, you can see right here that I've lifted these windows up. What you'll see here is that the bottom of the doors right here, these are almost sitting on the floor. And traditional houses, we'll go to it in the second part, but that's not where those windows go. So these windows are gonna be lifted up quite a bit. And so these are lifted up and they're wider. These are lifted up and they're a little bit shorter. So and thinner. And so there is good balance there. I've changed the spread on this thing, probably pulled it in about a foot or 2 on each side so that it's more compact. And also I'm showing that I'm highlighting, right, this center focus over the door so that my entry is really elevated and lifted up. I've increased the size of the columns. We'll go into more of that in the next video. But then look at the dormers, okay? And these dormers, I don't know if you can see them very well. I don't know if they look as bad as they do to me in person, but they're really tall, they're really heavy. And I think what happened is, as you can see that how much I've reduced them down here, I've also played with this roof. And so the reason these things are off kilter here is that I think the massing back here of this house overwhelms this front part. And so it looks like there's a big honking wart on the back of this house that overwhelms the house. And so what I've done is I've shown this house with a gable, which gives this a much bigger mass. And you don't have to do that gable as opposed to a hip roof, which it is now. But I think if you pulled this out here, it would give this whole centerpiece this kind of weight and this strength that it needs. But I'm showing the dormers a couple different ways. 1, I'm showing them, I've moved it out. If you're gonna make this a gable end house, this has to move out between those 2 windows there. And then if we kept the hip, that window stays there. But either way, these dormers shrink in size. And I wanted to just focus on that real quick the rest of this video and explain what happened here and what's going on. I believe that this gets kind of big and clunky because of the way it's framed. And if you look at the way dormers are framed today versus the way they were framed historically, they're very different. And essentially what happens is that if I look at the wall of this dormer, and essentially my dormers, I'm going to keep that same window size, but the proportion of face of this thing to glass is going to shrink down. Currently, the amount of glass to the face of this dormer is probably, I don't know, what do you think that is? 50%, somewhere in that range. I'm going to get it more about 90%. So my dormer is going to be much smaller. Well, how do I shrink that dormer down, you might say? Because I think what's happened is that if the builder doesn't know how to do a historic dormer, he's going to have his framer and the frame crew frame the dormer. And they're going to frame the dormer just like they frame the rest of the house. And so what happens is that this wall, right, if I drew a section through that wall, I've got siding, I've got a 2x4, right? They've got a 2x4, so that's 3.5 inches, and then they've got sheetrock on the inside. So that my wall here is 3.5 plus, let's just say, by the time you put sheathing and siding on there, you've got another 1/2 inch, so now it's 4.25, let's say, and then another 1/2 inch, so it's almost 5 inches, okay? 4 3/4 inches. What happens is because that's so wide, my trim out here has to be wide as well, okay? And so all of a sudden I start getting clunky right there. The other thing that's happening is by putting a header over top of this framed wall, and then cutting their roof rafters just like you would cut the other roof rafters, means that you end up with a very tall roof, okay? You end up with this big hunk and mass on top here because they've framed it out. And I think they put in probably a 2x6 header over top of this window. There's really no weight on this window. There's no weight on this dormer that you have to have a 2x6 header spanning that opening. And if you look at the way things were framed historically, they were never framed that way. So what I'm drawing right there is I'm drawing the two walls, right? And then they've got this big header over top. And then what happens is the framer says, well, now I need a roof rafter. So the roof rafter comes down, he's got a bird mouth, and then all of a sudden it does this, and it does the same thing on the other side. I end up with a big tall hat, okay? Now, what should have been done historically is that two things. One, instead of framing this with a 2x4 on the flat, it should have been turned and spin on the half, okay? So you got the same strength there, but all of a sudden my 2x4 is now 1.5 inches. Instead of 3.5, it's 1.5 inches. I've saved 2 inches right here. And if I put on my sheathing and I put on my drywall, now I'm 3.5 inches, right? Maybe 3.25, something like that. So I've reduced this by almost 2 inches. What that means is I can take now a 1x4 right there, because a 1x4 is 3.5 inches, and roughly in that size, and put my window right next to it. All of a sudden, I've shrunk down, and that's what I'm showing here, how much thinner I can make that look on the side. And if you look at historic dormers, they have basically a 1x and a 1x, and the window's stuck right inside there. Now, the other piece that happens is that instead of building the big header, I'm just going to do a small 2x4 across here. Remember, it's not a lot of weight that I'm carrying. I'm still going to have a joist that goes up, but I'm not going to have overhang here. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to angle my 2x4 like this, and my casing, my crown goes right here, okay? And then of course it goes across, and look how much lower, right, I am now. And there's my crown going across, there's my window coming down, and all of a sudden all of this top thing has been reduced by almost 40%. And so when we go back to this drawing here and how I got such small dormers, I've changed the way I'm framing it. I've changed the width of the side by turning the 2x4 on its side. Same strength, right? Just a thinner profile. And I've reduced the size of that hat over top here, right? So that my dormer can be much smaller, right? And so you see the size that it was, and now the size that it is, and all of a sudden it's much better. So just 4 or 5 things there, guys. The dormer size, right? The window placement, the window size really makes a big difference. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.